Story 1. Sometimes silence in old buildings feels heavier than noise, like the walls are holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. That was how the hotel felt most nights when I worked the late shift. It was one of those 18th century country places tucked away between fields and fog, the kind of building that seemed to creak even when no one moved. During the day, it looked charming, with ivy crawling up its brick walls and antique furniture, polished just enough to pass for elegant. But once the sun went down, the same furniture threw long shadows that made the place look like a painting that didn't want to be looked at too long. It was around 2 a.m. when it started. The night had been completely still. No wind, no guests wandering around, nothing but the soft hum of the reception heater and the ticking of the old clock above the front desk. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. That's usually when things change. Peace never lasts long in a place that old. The first thing I noticed was faint laughter. It was distant, muffled, like it was coming through a closed door somewhere upstairs. I brushed it off at first. Sometimes the plumbing made strange noises, or the old pipes groaned in ways that almost sounded human. But this didn't stop. It came in short bursts, like a group of children whispering jokes to each other. The strange thing was, there were no kids staying in the hotel that week. It was off-season, mostly older couples and business travelers. Still, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the sound was coming from outside, or maybe one of the guests had the TV on too loud. I walked to the reception window and looked out into the foggy courtyard, but there was nothing, just empty darkness and the faint orange glow of the garden lamps. The laughter came again, this time closer, and my skin prickled. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It sounded like several, overlapping, giggling like they were playing some game in the halls. I grabbed my torch and decided to check the upper floor. The hallway was narrow, with thick carpet that muffled every footstep. The lights were dim. One of the bulbs had been flickering all week, but no one had gotten around to fixing it. As I made my way down the corridor, the laughter stopped. Dead silence again. I paused in front of room 12, the one at the far end, overlooking the back garden. The air outside that door felt colder, like someone had opened a window somewhere. I could even see my breath when I exhaled. Then I saw it, a faint glow coming from under the door. It flickered, not steady like a lamp or a phone screen, more like candlelight. I froze. The room was supposed to be empty. The last guest had checked out that morning, and the cleaners hadn't mentioned anyone new checking in. I hesitated for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the light moved, like someone walking slowly around the room. The handle of the door was icy cold when I touched it. I pushed it open just enough to look inside. The smell hit first, something like old wax and damp fabric. The glow came from near the center of the room, and for a second I thought maybe a lamp had been left on. But then I saw it. Small, maybe 4 feet tall, the shape of a child holding a candle that barely lit its face. I couldn't make out the features clearly, but the outline was unmistakable. It stood perfectly still, facing the bed, not turning, not moving, just standing there. My first thought was that it was a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from somewhere. I blinked hard and turned my torch on. The beam cut through the darkness in a straight line, and the figure vanished instantly. The room was empty, completely still. The bed was untouched, the air thick with that musty candle smell, and the candle, if it had ever been there, was gone. I backed out slowly, shutting the door, trying to steady my breathing. I don't scare easily, but I remember my hands were shaking enough that I dropped my keyring. The clatter against the floor sounded deafening in the quiet. When I finally got back downstairs, I sat behind the reception desk and just listened. For nearly an hour, there was nothing. Then faintly from somewhere above me, the laughter started again, soft, distant, and fading, like it was being carried away down an endless hallway. The next morning, I went to check room 12 in daylight. The cleaner told me she'd found small footprints on the carpet, barefoot, leading from the bed toward the door. She said they weren't there before. I didn't say anything, just nodded and went back to the front desk. To this day, I still don't know what I saw. Maybe it was a trick of exhaustion or some weird reflection. But every time I think back to that night, I can still picture that flicker of candlelight, the faint outline of a child too still to be real, and the sound of laughter echoing through a hotel that hasn't hosted a family in years. Story 2. There are some places that just feel off, like the air itself is too heavy, like it's been holding its breath for years. That's how my friend's family property felt the first time I visited. It wasn't far out of town, but the long dirt road and scattered trees made it seem completely cut off from everywhere else. They had this big old metal shop that looked like it had been there since forever. Dirt floors, rusty tools, and shelves full of stuff no one had touched in decades. I went out there alone one weekend in late summer. I'd been stressed with work and needed a break, so I figured I'd camp out on the property. My friend said I could use the spot behind the shop near the creek. It sounded peaceful enough. I packed a small tent, a cooler, and a few beers. I got there around sunset and parked right beside the shop. The last rays of sunlight hit the metal walls, and for a moment, they glowed a dull orange. I remember thinking it looked like an old wound trying to heal. The inside of the shop was way worse than I remembered. Everything smelled like oil, dust, and mice. The light from the single fluorescent bulb was sickly, the kind that flickers every few seconds, humming just enough to get on your nerves. There were some old clown paintings in the loft above the main floor, like someone had hung them there decades ago and forgotten about them. The colors had faded to these washed-out pinks and blues, and they looked like they were watching everything below. I didn't stay inside long. I set up my tent outside, started a small fire, and made myself a drink. The night was quiet, except for the crickets and the occasional creak from the shop as it cooled down. For a while it was actually nice, the kind of silence that feels earned. Around midnight the fire was dying out, and I realized I hadn't seen another car or light in hours. Even the wind had stopped. Everything was still, too still. That's when I started noticing little things. A soft metallic clinking from inside the shop, like something tapping against a pipe. Then a short shuffle, like dirt being kicked. I told myself it was probably a raccoon. I tried to shake it off, sat by the last bit of the firelight, and finished my drink. But the noise kept happening, not steady, just every few minutes, like something testing whether I was still listening. At one point, it sounded like a slow drag across the floor, followed by a faint creak of wood. That's when I remembered the old chair in the corner. I'd seen it earlier when I peeked in. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I told myself I was imagining things. I stood up to take a leak and walked to the side of the shop where the window was. The fluorescent light was still on inside, buzzing. I looked through the glass, half curious, half trying to prove to myself that nothing was there. That's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a scrap of paper floating near the center of the shop. It was just sort of gliding through the air in slow loops, the way a leaf might fall if it had all the time in the world. I thought maybe a draft had caught something light, but the shop was sealed up tight. No windows open, no doors ajar. I kept watching, waiting for it to land, but it didn't. It moved in a pattern, almost deliberate, smooth figure eights over and over again. I remember squinting, thinking maybe it was a moth or something reflecting the light. But it didn't have wings and it didn't flicker. The way it moved, it was too smooth, too controlled. My stomach tightened because I couldn't make sense of it. It wasn't fast or violent, just calm, like it didn't even notice me. Then without warning, it stopped. For a second, it just hung there midair. Then it floated back, slowly, toward the far corner of the shop, the one with the wooden chair. I stayed frozen. Every instinct told me to look away, but I couldn't. The fluorescent light flickered once, and when it came back, the thing was gone. The corner was dark again, and the chair was just sitting there like nothing had happened. I backed away from the window and went straight to my car. I didn't even put out the fire. I sat in the driver's seat for a while, engine off, listening. There was nothing, not even the crickets. The next morning I went back inside. Sunlight poured through the open door, and the place looked ordinary again. Dirty, old, and harmless. But the chair was in a slightly different position, turned a few inches toward the window. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe I'd had too much to drink. I've told myself both things over and over, but neither explanation fits the way that thing moved. It wasn't random. It was like it was curious. I haven't gone back since. My friend still uses the property for family gatherings sometimes. He told me the fluorescent light in the shop turns itself on once in a while, even when the power's off. He laughs when he says it, but I can tell he's only half joking. I don't think I'll ever go near that shop again. Some places just feel like they're waiting for someone to notice them. And once you do, they don't forget. Story 3. Growing up, I always thought silence was supposed to mean peace, like when the world quiets down at night, and even the air feels tired. But in that house, silence didn't mean peace. It felt more like the world holding its breath, waiting for something to move. The place wasn't creepy in the usual way. It was an ordinary three-bedroom house on a quiet street with that old, faint smell of polish and dust, no matter how often you cleaned. My room was at the end of the hall facing the living room. From my bed, I could see straight through the open doorway, past the hallway light, and into the edge of the living room, where the faint glow from the street light outside usually landed. My parents' room was directly opposite, across that small stretch of space. That layout, simple as it was, became the reason I started dreading nights. It started with small things. The kind of things that make you second-guess your own senses. Sometimes when I woke up to use the bathroom, I'd think I heard faint movement in the living room. Not footsteps exactly, more like the sound of weight shifting. A creak in the floorboards, a soft rhythm that didn't belong to the wind or the old fridge's hum. The first few times I brushed it off. Houses make sounds. That's what I told myself. Wood expands, air moves, pipes click. But over time, the sounds turned into something more distinct. Something that felt deliberate. It began with pacing, a steady, almost calm movement. Steps that traced slow circles across the living room floor. It always started around midnight, sometimes later, and always when the rest of the house was quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing. I would lie perfectly still, my eyes on that faint slice of light spilling into the hall, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I told myself maybe I was dreaming, but the longer I listened, the more the pattern became too steady, too human. There was one night in particular that made everything real. I'd stayed up later than usual reading, and the house was quiet. That kind of silence that presses on your ears. When I finally turned off the light and lay down, I saw that familiar view down the hallway. The living room was mostly dark except for a dim orange glow from the streetlight filtering through the curtains. A few minutes later, I heard it again. The slow, careful steps. It wasn't fast or heavy, just deliberate, like someone walking in small circles, pausing every few seconds before moving again. I remember holding my breath, waiting for it to stop. I even tried to time my breathing so I wouldn't make noise. After a while, I started thinking maybe it was just the house. Maybe the air conditioner was shifting the floorboards. That was the only way I could stay calm enough to fall asleep. But then came the sound that I still can't explain. A sudden tap, like a finger brushing against the wall. Not random, not distant. It came from the exact direction of the living room, from where the sound of the pacing usually started. I waited, frozen, expecting it to stop. Instead, the tapping began to move, one slow sound at a time, closer to the hallway. Then silence again. It stayed that way for maybe a minute, quiet enough for me to start thinking I'd imagined the whole thing. I shifted in bed just a little, trying to peek down the hall without getting up. The streetlight caught a faint shape on the floor, like a shadow that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't detailed, just a patch of darker gray against the faint light. I blinked and it seemed to fade, but that was enough to send a shiver down my spine. For weeks after that, the pacing never stopped. I never saw anything again, but every night the sound came back. The same slow rhythm, the same faint steps. Sometimes it felt like whoever it was trying not to be heard, like they were walking carefully so as not to wake anyone. I never told my parents. I knew exactly how it would sound, like I'd been dreaming or letting my imagination get the better of me. So I just lived with it. Every night I'd lie there, eyes on the dark space at the end of the hall, waiting for the quiet that never really came. Eventually, I started sleeping with headphones on. I'd play low music just to drown out the sound. It worked most nights, but there were times the battery would die in the middle of the night, and I'd wake up again to that same rhythm. Slow, steady, as if the house itself was breathing. When I moved out years later, I thought maybe I'd finally get away from it. But the first few nights in my new apartment, I still woke up around midnight, waiting to hear those steps. It took months before my brain stopped listening for them. I've tried to explain it rationally over the years. Maybe it was pipes, or something in the walls, or the house settling unevenly. But deep down, I know how deliberate it sounded, how steady, how human. Sometimes I still think about that house. My parents still live there. And when I visit, everything looks the same. The same layout, the same creaky floors, the same faint smell of polish and old wood. I never ask if they hear anything at night. Part of me doesn't want to know. Story 4. There's something about old office buildings that feels like they remember things. The air holds on to whispers longer than it should, like dust that never fully settles. That's the best way I can describe the place I worked in when this happened. Heavy air, creaking walls, and that faint smell of paper that's been sitting around for decades. It wasn't haunted looking or anything dramatic, just tired. You could tell it had seen people come and go for a long time. I'd only been at the job for about 2 weeks when it happened. The building was pre-war. Tall ceilings, old radiators that clanged randomly, and those yellow-tinted fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly older than it was. That night, I'd stayed later than usual, trying to finish a report before the next morning's meeting. Everyone else had already left, and the floor was completely silent except for the occasional hum from the vending machine near the break area. It must have been close to 9 p.m. when I finally saved my work and started packing up. I remember the kind of tired where your brain feels like it's running on fumes. Not exhausted, just sluggish. I grabbed my bag and realized I needed to use the restroom before heading out. The nearest one was down the hall, around a corner that always felt a bit darker than the rest of the floor. As I got close, I saw someone ahead of me, or at least I thought I did. The person opened the restroom door and went in. I caught the movement clearly because the overhead light flickered when the door swung open. I noticed, oddly enough, that they were wearing a pink shirt and khakis, the exact same outfit I had on that day. I even had a moment of mild embarrassment, like some subconscious reaction to seeing my accidental twin. I hesitated a bit because, honestly, I hate using the bathroom when someone else is in there. But I was too tired to wait around, so after a few seconds, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty. Not, I might have missed them in a stall kind of empty. I mean empty. All the stalls were open, lights were on, and there wasn't a single sound. The air was still, not just quiet, but unnaturally still. I remember the temperature dropping slightly, or maybe that was in my head, but I felt it, a kind of cold that starts inside your chest. I stood there for a few seconds, not moving, my hand still on the door. My reflection in the mirror looked strangely sharp under the harsh lights. I thought maybe the person had just walked out another door, but there was only one entrance, the one I'd come through. I checked the stalls anyway, even crouched a little to see if there were any shoes under the partitions. Nothing. That's when I noticed how loud my heartbeat had gotten. Not because I was scared yet, just because the silence was that deep. No pipes, no distant footsteps, no hum from the lights. Total silence. It made my own breathing sound strange, like it didn't belong in that room. I started to tell myself logical things. Maybe I saw a reflection, maybe it was a janitor, maybe it was just a trick of the light, but none of it added up. I had seen the door move. I had seen the sleeve of that pink shirt and the khakis, the angle, the lighting. It wasn't a trick. And then something small but very real happened. The automatic paper towel dispenser by the sink went off. Just once. The sound made me jump so hard I almost dropped my bag. A single sheet slid out, slow and deliberate, and then it went quiet again. I didn't move. I just stared at it for a few seconds, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. That should have been my cue to just laugh it off, but instead, I felt this heavy awareness. The kind where you know you're not supposed to be somewhere. Like when you walk into a dark room and your instincts tell you to leave before your brain catches up. I can't explain it better than that. I didn't use the restroom. I just turned around, walked out, and didn't look back. I didn't even turn off the light or check the hallway behind me. The elevator took forever to come, and every second I stood there, I kept expecting to hear footsteps or the door opening again, but nothing. just that same old silence. When I got to the lobby, the security guard at the desk glanced up and asked if I was the last one from the fifth floor. I nodded, still half in my own head, and he mentioned something about how that floor creeped him out at night. I didn't ask why. The next morning, I went straight to work like nothing happened. I told myself it was just tiredness, that maybe I'd seen my reflection in the glass panel beside the door. Maybe I'd imagined the color wrong. The mind does weird things when it's running on caffeine and stress, but a part of me still wonders. Because I know what I saw. Someone wearing exactly what I was wearing, walking into that room seconds before I did. And unless my eyes were playing the cruelest trick ever, there was no one else there when I went in. I've stayed late plenty of times since then, but I've never used that restroom again. Story 5. They say some places hold silence like an old wound. Quiet on the surface, but deep underneath, something still bleeds. That's how my cousin's grandpa's backyard felt the summer I stayed there in 2015. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, more like the world holding its breath. I was maybe 16 or 17, just old enough to feel too old for fear, but still young enough to believe in weird coincidences. That evening had been slow, warm, and lazy. The kind of evening where the air hangs heavy and you can hear your own thoughts too clearly. My cousin wasn't home, so I was by myself, killing time behind the house. The backyard wasn't much, just a patch of grass, some old chairs, and a few trees that always seemed to be leaning in too close. The house sat right behind me, and from where I stood, I could see the living room window clearly. It had one of those heavy curtains that barely moved even when the wind tried. I was just scrolling through my phone, waiting for my cousin to get back from wherever she went, when I heard it, a sharp thud against glass. It sounded like someone had slammed a palm against the window. I froze and looked up. That's when I saw her. A woman stood behind the window, hitting the glass and crying. Not just crying, she looked hysterical, like she was trying to get out or keep something out. Her face was wet, her mouth open in silent sobs, and her hands kept slapping the window pane. I didn't recognize her. I thought maybe a neighbor had wandered in or someone had broken in. My first instinct was to shout, to ask if she was okay, but my throat locked up. After a second that felt like forever, I managed to ask if she needed help, but she didn't respond. She just turned toward me for half a second, and it was strange, because even though I could see her face clearly, it didn't feel like she was looking at me. It was more like she was looking through me. Then she suddenly pulled the curtain shut, and the sound stopped. The air went completely still. I stood there confused and scared, but also trying to be rational. Maybe she was a relative I hadn't met. Maybe my cousin's grandparents had someone staying over. But I knew for sure her grandparents were out. They'd gone to visit a family friend earlier that afternoon. I even watched them drive off, and the house had been locked. Still, I convinced myself I must have seen something explainable. Maybe a reflection? Maybe someone outside on the other side? The mind tries to find the easy answer, but I couldn't shake the image of her, the way she'd been beating the glass, the sound of it echoing in the quiet yard. After standing there for a while, I decided to check inside. The front door was locked just like before, and I had to use the spare key from under the mat. As soon as I stepped in, I called out, but the house was dead silent. I went to the living room, the same one with the window, and everything looked normal. No signs of anyone, no footprints, no wet spots on the glass. The curtains were drawn tight, but when I pulled them open, the window was spotless. No fingerprints, no smudges, nothing. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out shaky. I even checked every room, half expecting to find someone hiding, but the house was empty. It didn't make sense. When my cousin got back later, I told her what I'd seen. She looked at me weirdly and said that maybe I had been seeing things, that her grandma always locked up tight whenever she left. Then she paused for a second and added quietly that sometimes the old neighbors talked about strange sounds from that window, like someone crying, but she never took them seriously. I didn't either. Not really, but that night I couldn't sleep. Lying in the guest room, I kept replaying it, the way her hands smacked the glass, the look on her face, the quiet that followed. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, A reflection from the street, anything that made sense. But the window faced the backyard, not the road. There were no passing cars. No light could have hit it that way. Even now, I don't know what I saw. I've tried explaining it 100 ways. A shadow, a trick of the mind, stress, imagination. But none of it fits. I know what I saw. A woman inside that house crying and pounding on the window. And then she was gone. Every time I think back to that moment, I still hear the faint tapping. Just once. Like glass settling after being touched. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe the mind really does fill silence with ghosts. Or maybe some silences aren't empty after all. Story 6. Sometimes life feels like it skips a frame. Like when a movie glitches and you catch something that shouldn't be there. That's the only way I can describe what happened that afternoon when I was 13, standing on the balcony of my friend's old apartment building. It was early winter, the kind of day where the air bites a little, but the sky still tries to stay blue. My friend's family had moved out a week earlier, so the place was empty now. I was there helping her mom clean before handing the keys over, but she had gone downstairs to meet someone. I remember stepping outside for a quick break, just to feel the cold and stretch my legs. The balcony overlooked an open parking lot, completely still except for a grocery bag caught on a fence, flapping softly. I left the sliding door cracked behind me because I'd forgotten my jacket inside. When I turned to grab it, I swear I saw myself standing at the far end of the balcony. At first I thought it was just the glass door reflecting me back. But when I took a step closer, the other me didn't move. She was about 3 feet away, turned slightly, leaning on the railing like she was looking down at something. I froze, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone else was there? But the more I looked, the more impossible it seemed. She was wearing the same jacket I just picked up, the same ponytail, even the same little rip on the left sleeve I'd torn last week. I blinked hard, like I could shake the image off, but she turned, slowly, and smiled. It wasn't sinister, just familiar. Too familiar. Then she stepped around the corner of the balcony, disappearing down the stairs. The sound of her footsteps was real. I heard it, the soft thud of sneakers on the metal stairs. My brain was scrambling to make it logical. Maybe someone else had come up from below. Maybe I'd seen a neighbor's kid who happened to look like me. I went to the railing, peered over, but the stairs led to an empty parking lot. No one was there. The whole lot was silent. Trying not to panic, I went down the opposite stairs at the other end of the building, thinking maybe I'd run into whoever it was. I circled the lot, checked under the staircase, even looked around the dumpsters near the back. Nothing. Not a single person in sight. It was only when I got back upstairs that the weirdest part hit me. The sliding door I'd left slightly open was now completely shut and locked from the inside. That shouldn't have been possible. I didn't have the keys and no one else was there. I just stood there for a long time, staring at my faint reflection in the glass, trying to remember if maybe I'd closed it without thinking. But I knew I hadn't. I could still picture it, how I'd left it open to grab my jacket, the same jacket the other me had been wearing. Eventually, I called it a day and left. I tried to convince myself I'd just been jumpy, tired from cleaning, maybe spooked by a reflection. But something about the smile, the quiet confidence of it, still unsettles me. It wasn't a reflection. It moved when I didn't. For years, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to sound crazy. But sometimes when I replay it in my head, I remember the timing. My friend's mom said later that she thought she heard me moving around inside while she was downstairs, about the same time I was outside on the balcony. That detail has always bothered me the most. If she really heard footsteps inside, who or what was walking in there when I was standing outside? I don't know what I saw that day. Maybe it was a trick of light or a stress-induced hallucination. But every now and then, when I catch my reflection in a dark window, I half expect it to smile before I do. Story 7. You know how sometimes the night feels heavier than usual? Like the air itself is pressing down on you? That's how it was that night. The kind of stillness that makes even your breathing sound loud. I live alone in a one-bedroom apartment, nothing fancy, just a small couch, a desk, and a cheap lamp that hums when it's on. It had been a long day, And I remember scrolling through my phone until my eyes started to burn. I switched everything off and lay back, waiting for sleep that never came. That's when it started. It wasn't noise that woke me up exactly. More like awareness, like something in the room had shifted. The air felt thicker somehow, and I could tell, even before opening my eyes, that I wasn't alone. I lay still for a while, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, maybe a leftover dream blending into the dark. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I finally opened my eyes and froze. Across the room, near the opposite wall, was the shape of someone small, like a child, standing completely still. At first I thought it had to be my eyes adjusting. Maybe the light from outside was catching something weird in the apartment. My window faces the street, and sometimes car headlights bounce off the walls, creating strange patterns. But this wasn't that. It wasn't moving. It wasn't flickering. It was just there. A dark, solid outline. Too solid to be a trick of light. The shape was facing me. I could tell by the way it stood. Small shoulders, head slightly tilted, hands at its sides. No features, no details. Just a silhouette darker than the dark around it. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight, but my hand was trembling so badly that I almost dropped it. The light flicked on, bright and harsh, and the shape was gone. Just the empty space between the couch and the wall. I scanned the entire room, heart pounding, half expecting someone to dart out from behind the furniture. But there was nothing. I even checked the corners, behind the curtains, under the table. Still nothing. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it must have been some kind of optical illusion. Maybe my eyes playing tricks after waking up suddenly. I turned the light off again, just to prove to myself that it was fine. The shape was back, exactly where it had been, as if it had never left. This time I didn't move for a long time. My chest felt tight, like something was squeezing the air out of me. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, sat up, and stared. The outline didn't shift, didn't fade. It just stood there, perfectly still. I switched the light on again, and like before, it vanished instantly. The wall looked ordinary. The couch looked ordinary. Everything was as it should be. But as soon as I turned the light off, it was back, standing in the same spot, facing me. At that point, my brain started running in circles. I checked for shadows, maybe from something outside. I even opened the window blinds trying to see if a street lamp was hitting something weird. But the silhouette wasn't reacting to anything. When the light was on, nothing. When it was off, it returned. I tried moving the lamp to a different outlet, thinking maybe the bulb was flickering weirdly. Still the same result. I can't even describe the kind of fear that sits in your stomach when logic fails. It's not the kind that makes you scream. It's quieter, heavier. You just sit there, realizing that nothing makes sense. I ended up sleeping with the lights on that night. Or rather, I stayed awake with the lights on, watching that same empty patch of floor until morning came through the blinds. When the sunlight filled the room, it almost felt silly. I walked back over to the spot again, checking for any reflective surface. A toy, a trick of shadow. There was nothing there that could have made that shape. Not even close. The space was too plain, too open. I even tried turning the light off in broad daylight, just to see. Of course, nothing showed up. For the next few nights, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the dark. Every time I turned the light off, I'd imagine that same outline waiting for me again. The worst part was, it wasn't just fear, it was recognition. Like something in me knew what it was, even if I didn't want to admit it. After a while, I stopped trying to explain it. I'd already ruled out headlights, shadows, sleep paralysis, every logical reason I could think of. And yet sometimes, even weeks later, when the light flickers or my room goes dark for a second, I still feel that same weight in the air, that same sense of being watched. It could be just my mind filling in the gaps. Maybe it was something else. I'll never really know. But one thing's for sure, I haven't slept in total darkness since that night. Story 8. There are memories that cling to the back of your mind like old cobwebs. You forget they're there until something brushes against them, and suddenly you're right back in that moment. For me, it's that stretch of country road I used to bike down when I was about 8 or 9. I can still picture the long gravel path lined with overgrown grass, the faint buzz of summer insects, and that weird stillness that always seemed to hang over the fields once the sun started dipping. It was one of those roads that felt endless, where every bend looked the same as the last. I used to ride it almost every evening after school, sometimes racing the daylight home, sometimes just pedaling slow and thinking about nothing. That day was supposed to be normal. The air was heavy with the smell of corn and dirt, and my tires kicked up tiny clouds of dust behind me. I remember how the shadows of the trees were stretching long across the road, thin and sharp like black ribbons. Everything looked still, too still actually. Even the birds had gone quiet, which I didn't notice at first. You don't notice silence until it feels wrong. I only realized it when my bike chain clicked louder than usual, echoing against the still air. Halfway down the road, there's a turn that cuts between two big fields, one full of soybeans, the other corn. The corn was tall that time of year, tall enough to look like a green wall on both sides. As I came up to that bend, I remember feeling this weird chill run through me, even though the air was warm. It wasn't fear at first, just that strange instinct you get when you know you're being watched, even if you can't see by what. I slowed my bike without really deciding to, and that's when I saw it. Something small darted across the road a few yards ahead of me, moving fast. Way too fast for a person, but too solid for a shadow. I hit the brakes hard, tires skidding slightly on the gravel. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a stray dog or a fox. But then I realized it wasn't shaped right. It was upright. It ran on two legs. It crossed from the soybean field into the corn, vanishing between the stalks in less than a second. But I swear I saw enough to know it wasn't human. It was about the height of a small kid, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, but its body was completely covered in yellow. Not clothes. It didn't move like fabric. More like skin or some kind of suit that stuck tight. The head was darker, maybe green, like it was wearing something or had something growing on it. I froze, one foot still on the pedal, just staring at the spot it disappeared. I waited for it to come back out. I don't know why. Maybe I expected a farmer, maybe some prankster kid. But nothing moved. Not even the corn stalks where it had gone in. The silence pressed in again, thick and heavy. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. After a minute, I started pedaling slowly forward, eyes darting to the sides of the road. Every rustle of wind in the leaves made me flinch. I told myself it had to be a scarecrow or something the farmer set up, maybe a trick of light. But that didn't fit either. I'd seen that field 100 times before, and there was never anything like that near the road. And scarecrows don't run. When I got home, my mom said I looked pale. I told her I was just tired from riding too long. I didn't mention what I'd seen because even then, I knew how it would sound. A small yellow figure with a green head running across the road. It sounded like something out of a comic book. Later that night, though, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that moment again. The flicker of yellow, the way it moved like it knew exactly where to go. I thought about going back the next day to look for tracks or something, but the idea made my stomach twist. I didn't want to find anything. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I rode past that same spot in the middle of the day, sunlight blazing down, everything looking normal. No strange figures, no marks in the dirt. But I did notice something odd. The first few rows of corn where I'd seen it run through were bent, like something heavy had passed through. The rest of the field was untouched. Even now, I can't explain it. I've heard people talk about lost time or weird sightings out in rural areas, glowing lights, shapes that don't make sense, sounds that stop you cold. I don't know what I saw, and maybe I never will. But every so often, when I'm driving late and a stretch of empty road flashes past my headlights, I think about that little figure in yellow, vanishing into the corn without a sound. And I still wonder, if I'd been just a few seconds faster on that bike, would it have seen me first? Story 9. Some nights the hospital felt less like a building and more like a living thing. Quiet but breathing. The air hummed faintly. Lights flickered when the generator kicked in, and the hum of old machines made it feel like something unseen was always awake, watching. I'd worked night shifts before, but something about the prison wing always sat wrong with me. Maybe it was the silence after the officers made their last rounds. Or maybe it was just the way that corridor seemed colder than the rest of the hospital, even when the air conditioning was off. I'd been on that floor for about 6 months. The prison section only had a few rooms. 123 and 234 were side by side, divided by a single wall. They weren't special rooms, just old ones that hadn't been remodeled in years. The kind of spaces where the paint never quite dries right, and the lights buzz no matter how many times maintenance fixes them. The night this happened, everything started off normal. I'd made my rounds, checked on the inmates, and the officers had gone quiet, scrolling through their phones in the break area. I remember thinking it was going to be an easy shift. Then I heard it, a faint tapping, like someone knocking lightly on a wooden surface. It was soft at first, so I figured it was the plumbing or maybe an inmate shifting around. I followed the sound, and it led me toward room 234. When I opened the door, the inmate in there was asleep. The heart monitor was steady, and the TV was off. I stood there for a minute, listening. The tapping stopped, replaced by what sounded like the faint murmur of children talking. Quick, whispery words I couldn't make out. I froze. The rooms around 234 were empty that night, so there was no reason to hear anyone. The hallway was dead silent. I checked the vents, the bathroom, even under the bed. Nothing. The sound faded out like it had never been there in the first place. I told myself it was just the building. Old hospitals make noises, pipes, air vents, weird echoes. Still, when I went back to my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something. I kept glancing at the hallway camera feed that showed 234. Around 2 a.m., I saw a flicker on the monitor, like motion. For a second, I thought someone had gotten out of bed, but when I looked closer, the inmate was still lying there, perfectly still. The motion had been near the foot of the bed, a small blur, too short to be an adult. I thought maybe it was a glitch, static interference, or reflection. But then, a few minutes later, the nurse call light for 234 blinked on. I went down there again. The inmate was half awake, disoriented, mumbling something about someone standing by the bed. I tried to calm him, told him there was no one there. He looked toward the corner near the floor, his eyes following something I couldn't see. His monitor spiked for a few seconds, then steadied. After he drifted off again, I stood there longer than I should have, listening. The air was heavy. I swear I could hear breathing that wasn't mine. The next few shifts, I kept noticing strange things in that room. The TV would turn itself on to static even when it was unplugged. The lights would flicker only when I walked by that section of the hall. One night, I caught the faint sound of laughter coming from inside 234. It wasn't an adult laugh. It was higher, quicker, and it stopped the second I stepped through the doorway. The inmate in the bed was sleeping soundly, but the TV was glowing faintly, showing a cartoon channel, even though the cable box was off. After that, I asked to switch wings for a bit, but short staffing made it impossible. The next time I was in 234, I noticed small things had moved around. The water cup was not where I left it. The curtain was slightly pulled back. Nothing major, just enough to make me second-guess myself. The kind of stuff you can't prove but can't ignore either. The weirdest part was how the temperature dropped every time I entered that room. I'd walk in and instantly feel a chill down my neck, even though the thermostat read normal. One night during my last week on that floor, I was alone doing charting at the nurse station. Everything was quiet until I heard running footsteps, light ones, across the hall, like a child sprinting barefoot. I looked up, expecting to see an officer or someone who'd lost their way, but the corridor was empty. Every cell door was locked, every room still. Then came the sound of something hitting metal, like a soft thud under a bed frame. I walked back toward 234, flashlight in hand, and stopped at the doorway. The room looked normal except for the TV. It was on again, glowing faintly with an image of static and faint children's voices mixed in the fuzz. I stood there trying to convince myself it was just interference. But then I saw it, the edge of something pale slip under the bed, fast like someone crawling away from the light. My chest tightened, and I couldn't move for a second. I aimed the flashlight, crouched down, and there was nothing. Just the shadows and the hum of the machines. I didn't say anything to anyone. You don't last long in that job if you start talking about things like that. People joke that hospital night shifts mess with your head, that exhaustion and flickering lights can make you see things. Maybe that's true, but I've worked in a lot of wards, ICU, ER, even the morgue, and I've never had a place feel as wrong as that room. To this day, I avoid walking past it if I can help it. The new nurses sometimes mention how they hate doing checks there at night because it feels off. They laugh it off, but I can tell they feel it too. The cold, the strange flicker on the TV, the sense that something small is always moving just out of sight. Maybe it's the building settling. Maybe it's stress, imagination, or bad wiring. But sometimes when the lights dim and the halls go quiet, I still think about that flicker under the bed. And I wonder if anyone else has seen the kid. Story 10. There's something about old houses that makes them feel alive, like they breathe through the cracks, sigh through the pipes, and whisper through the walls when everything else goes quiet. My dad's house was one of those. It wasn't ancient or falling apart, but it carried a kind of heaviness, like the walls had seen too much and refused to forget. Every time I stayed there for the weekend, I'd feel it, the strange stillness, the uneasy quiet that settled the moment the front door shut behind me. It had been raining all afternoon, and the air felt heavy and sticky inside. The kind of weather that makes the floors creak for no reason, and shadows look thicker than usual. I remember heading upstairs to take a shower before bed. The light at the end of the hallway flickered just once as I started up the stairs, that weak yellow bulb struggling to stay alive. It wasn't unusual. The wiring in that house was old. But still, every sound felt amplified, every corner darker than it should have been. The bathroom was at the very end of the hall, but to get there, I had to pass the bedroom I usually slept in. It was the same one I shared with my sisters when we were younger, and it hadn't changed much. Same bunk beds, same faded posters peeling off the wall, same smell of old wood and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. I wasn't thinking about anything weird when I passed by the door, just focused on getting my shower over with so I could crash. Then I caught a glimpse of something in the room, something that made me stop mid-step. It was just a flicker of movement at first, a shadow where there shouldn't have been one. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the blanket on the bottom bunk shift, like someone had just sat up. I froze, leaning slightly to look into the room, half expecting to see a pile of laundry that had fallen, or maybe one of the cats sneaking in. But what I saw wasn't either of those. There was a figure sitting up on the bottom bunk, a small one. At first I thought maybe I was just seeing things, the way dim light plays tricks when you're tired. But then the shape moved. It looked like a little girl, no older than 7 or 8, sitting there under the blanket. Her skin looked pale in the dim light, almost gray, and her hair was cut in a short, straight bob that framed her face. The weirdest part was her eyes. They were huge, too big for her face, and dark in the center like ink spreading through water. She was facing sideways, her shoulder turned toward me, and for a second it looked like she was staring at the wall. But then slowly, her head turned. Just her head. The rest of her body didn't move, not even a twitch. Our eyes met, or at least I think they did. I don't remember breathing. I don't even remember blinking. The room felt wrong, like the air had thickened, and every sound in the house went completely silent. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds, but it felt longer, like time stretched out just to let the fear sink in. Then without any sound, she just lowered her head again, as if lying back down. The blanket barely moved when she did. My legs felt like they'd turned to stone, but somehow I managed to back away slowly, trying not to make a noise. I didn't run. I don't even think I could have. But I walked straight into the bathroom, shut the door, and locked it. For a long time I stood there staring at the floor, listening. The pipes creaked. Water dripped somewhere behind the wall. But there were no footsteps, no voices, no sign of movement from the bedroom. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door again, everything looked normal. The light from the hallway shone faintly into the room, hitting the bunk bed just enough for me to see that the blanket was flat, undisturbed, empty. I tried telling myself I'd imagined it, that maybe I'd been tired, the shadows had messed with my eyes, or maybe it was just the reflection from the window playing tricks. But that house had always had a presence. Sometimes things would move on their own. A chair would scrape slightly against the floor, even when no one was near it. You'd hear footsteps upstairs when everyone was sitting in the living room. Once, the radio turned itself on in the middle of the night and played static until my dad unplugged it. After that night, I started noticing smaller things whenever I stayed over. My phone would slide off the table without any reason. The ceiling light in that same bedroom would flicker only when I was inside. And sometimes, late at night, if I left the door open even a crack, I'd swear I could hear the faint creak of the bottom bunk, like someone shifting their weight ever so slightly. I've thought about that night more times than I'd like to admit. I've replayed it, questioned it, tried to rationalize every part of it. Maybe it was sleep deprivation, maybe it was a shadow, maybe it was just my brain filling in gaps that weren't really there. But here's what I can't explain. The next morning, when I walked past that room again, the blanket on the bottom bunk was rumpled, creased right in the shape of where someone would have been sitting. I didn't say anything to my dad. I just finished breakfast, grabbed my bag, and told him I'd be heading home early. He didn't ask why. He just nodded, almost like he already knew. I still visit sometimes, but I don't sleep in that room anymore. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. The bunk beds are gone now, replaced with a single bed. But every once in a while, when I walk past the doorway at night, I catch myself glancing at that corner, half expecting to see that pale little girl sitting there again, waiting. And every time I do, I swear the air gets colder, just for a second.